Hello and welcome to Manning Publications Twitch. I'm Chuck Gehman. Thanks for joining me this afternoon. Today we're going to walk through some of the content from my new book, AWS CloudFormation in Action, published by Manning in the MEAP program, the Manning Early Adopter Program. So far we have 4 chapters. I've just finished a 5th chapter that will be out soon, and I'm looking forward to getting feedback in the MEET program and completing more chapters of the book every month. And yeah, so first let me tell you a little bit about our what the purpose of the book is. Give you a little overview. Give you a little background on infrastructure as code, and talk about how CloudFormation fits into the infrastructure as code ecosystem and the AWS ecosystem. So again, thanks for joining me today, and we'll just jump right in. So to give you an overview of the book, it starts out in the first chapter actually talking about the the infrastructure as code world. So there's several tools out there. We kind of catalog them and compare them to one another a little bit. And so if you're new to infrastructure as code, that'll give you a good background to really understand what the strengths and weaknesses are of the various systems that you can use to do this. You probably know infrastructure as code basically takes what you've been doing either manually with physical hardware and software and buying servers, installing the operating system, configuring the operating system, and then installing applications, setting up networking, putting it on the internet, setting up security. All of those things are now done with software, with the software development paradigm. And that's where infrastructure as code tools come in. They enable you to write the software that configures the hardware and software, mostly in a cloud environment, but some of these tools can also work with hardware that you already have in your data center or on your premises of your company. And so they're very powerful tools. CloudFormation is the AWS native infrastructure as code tool. And so what it lets you do is access virtually all of the AWS resources, either from the AWS console, from the AWS command line, or via APIs to deploy resources. So if you're already using AWS, you know that you can go to the console, you can launch an EC2 instance, SSH into it, install software, and off you go. You've got a website or whatever your application is. So what we're going to see here today is we're going to go through a couple of examples. The topic today is the CloudFormation Stack Lifecycle. So what we call a stack is the deployed infrastructure. And you can have as many stacks as you want deployed. They can represent different applications or a global complex application or set of applications that your company uses. And so we're going to walk through the life cycle of building a template, which is what we call a file that contains the description of the infrastructure as code, deploy that template, which we call creating a stack, then we'll update it, and then we'll delete it. And then later in the session, we're actually going to deploy a live website that you can see. Now, all of the examples today are going to be on GitHub, and the GitHub where they live is Charles Gehman. You can call me Chuck, but Charles Gehman is my official name, / AWS CloudFormation in Action. So go to GitHub, check out the repo. It's got chapters 2 through 4. 1 is an introductory chapter and it doesn't have any code associated with it. So that's all out there as a resource for you. So we're going to mostly cover chapter 3, but I'm going to pop into chapter 2 here for a second and we'll take a look at the book. So, one of the greatest things that Manning does is, this publication of the book into an ebook, and then, the book isn't completely done. So as I mentioned right now, actually, let me pop over here for a second. We actually have 4 chapters done. I've completed a 5th, but it hasn't been published yet, but it will be in the next couple of weeks. And so let's just look through the table of contents for a second before we jump back into chapter 2. So as I mentioned, the first chapter is about infrastructure as code, generically speaking. It talks about Terraform, which you've probably heard of. It talks about Ansible, Salt Stack, and CloudFormation, of course, is part of the comparison. I'm adding in a newer tool called Pulumi into that chapter. And that's the other great thing, is that the chapters can be updated while the book is in MEEP based on feedback that I get from readers. And this has been out since April, and I've already gotten some really great feedback from people that have read the book, and quite a few people have bought the book already as well. At the end, I'm going to give you a code you can use for 40% off of any Manning ebooks. So one thing I'd like to say about the book also, as we go through the table of contents here, is that, there is fantastic documentation from AWS. And there are a lot of great blogs with a lot of great examples of building CloudFormation templates and deploying stacks for untold applications. Now, the purpose of the book is to fill in and provide more detail to those other resources and provide it in an order that really goes from simple to more complex. So here we are in one of the first chapters of the book, and you'll see it's very, very simple, but it'll allow you, if you haven't ever done CloudFormation or any infrastructure as code tool before, this will allow you to get rolling immediately, get some stacks out there, get some infrastructure deployed, and learn. So that's really the key goal of the book. So as I said, we're going to do a couple of examples from chapter 2, which introduces CloudFormation. Then we're going to go into chapter 3, which is about the lifecycle, as I mentioned. Build the template, create the stack, update the stack, delete the stack. I've just completed a chapter on managing change. Things start to get very interesting in chapter 5, so that'll be out there shortly. Then in chapter 6, which I've just begun to write, we're actually going to go from deploying simple websites that are on a single instance with security, with access control, and with a lot of the more complex features, internet routing, network address translation, a lot of the things that you must do on AWS to deploy applications into production. Now we're going to take those concepts that we've learned through chapter 5 and apply them to a multi-region, multi-availability zone, database-driven website, deploying several servers, deploying auto-scaling, which we actually did do in chapter 4 as well, and load balancing, DNS, all the things that you want to know how to do with CloudFormation. So then monitoring health and performance is an incredibly important part of DevOps. And so we're going to get into that in chapter 7. In chapter 8, we're going to talk even more about DevOps and using version control systems and the AWS DevOps lifecycle tools to deploy and to manage your templates. So that's going to be a really great chapter. Then we're going to get into containers and serverless, the cloud native applications. We'll talk about ECS, the Elastic Container Service, and EKS, the Elastic Kubernetes Service on AWS, and how to use it from CloudFormation and where CloudFormation fits in. A lot of people question, when you're using Kubernetes, is there a reason to use infrastructure as code tools? And you'll find out there definitely is. So the next section is going to be CloudFormation via APIs. And what's a really interesting thing that a lot of me and my colleagues have been talking about recently is that there's a thing called the CDK, and it just came out last fall. It stands for the Cloud Development Kit. It's an AWS created tool that's open source. And what it does is it lets you use CloudFormation from an imperative programming language. And so these are the programming languages that developers are most familiar with. And the ones that AWS has chosen to support initially are C#, Python, TypeScript, and JavaScript. So this lets you actually generate CloudFormation templates from your favorite programming language. Really, really powerful. Decreases the sharpness of the learning curve, we could put it that way. You can't do absolutely everything from the CDK, but the CDK combined with the AWS SDK and APIs that have already existed, for example, with Python Boto 3, you should be able to do absolutely everything that's possible to do with CloudFormation. And the key thing is that it's opening up CloudFormation to a broader range of skill sets. You don't have to necessarily read my book. Of course, you should. But you could jumpstart your way to getting infrastructure deployed easier. And this is still a work in progress. It is open source. It's on GitHub. You can contribute to it, as many people are already beginning to do. So it's really created a new community, and it's really blown up in the last few months. It's only really been out since November. Some great blogs on it out there, both from AWS technical staffers as well as from third parties. So I definitely encourage you to check it out. And then we're going to get into things like system management and a variety of other important tools around AWS that you can use with CloudFormation at the end of the book. So I hope you enjoy today's session again. Let's jump right in and start building stacks. So here we are in chapter 2. And for those of you that aren't familiar with CloudFormation at all, first of all, you compose the template, you build the template in a text editor, generally speaking, like you would with any software. Then in this example, because this is at the beginning of the book, I am going to show you the command line as well. Simple examples. You go into the AWS console, you go to CloudFormation, you choose Create Stack, you upload that template that you created with the text editor into CloudFormation. It evaluates the template. There can be parameters that the deploying user types in to modify the template behavior. And then after you've typed that in, you go through a couple of other pages of confirmation. You hit Create Stack, and boom, it's deployed. And on your right-hand side of this graphic, there are some examples of the types of resources on AWS that you can deploy. You can configure identity and access management, EC2, of course, set up VPCs, virtual private cloud, set up auto scaling, set up the internet gateway and all your routing, configure CloudWatch monitoring and events, deploy Amazon RDS, the database systems. You can also do services and endpoints of AWS, and of course, S3. So some really, really cool flexibility and a lot of control over what you can do. So now we're going to look through this chapter a little bit. Now this chapter extensively covers the template structure. So this is an important thing we should talk about. So you can either choose to write your CloudFormation templates in JSON, which is the original format that was used for CloudFormation templates, or in YAML. Now, YAML's only been out since 2017, but it's quite popular. Now, the neat thing about AWS CloudFormation is you can use them both. You can use them pretty interchangeably. And we're going to take a quick look in a little while at the AWS CloudFormation Designer, which is a GUI inside the console of AWS. And it actually lets you switch back and forth between YAML and JSON. So most of the examples I'm going to show you, actually all of the examples I'm going to show you today are in JSON. And I like to use JSON because I've been doing this for a while. There are a tremendous number of JSON examples out there in the world of templates that you can deploy. AWS has taken to providing generally both code snippets and or entire templates in both formats. So that's useful. But either way, the templates that are used with CloudFormation consist of these major sections. So there's the version, which is simply the template format version. And now I think everyone who uses CloudFormation believes that at some point this template format version will change. Right now it's 2010-0909, and that's the only thing that goes into this section. So we won't talk more about this. It's not super important at the moment. It's described in detail in the book, but you know, it's if there were multiple versions and they were versioning the ability to handle the templates, which clearly they are, but there is only this one version. You can refer to it. So then there's the description of the template, and this is basically a large text string. For JSON, it's the primary documentation for the template. So you would describe the template in this description at the top of the template. Now, the templates are human readable, and they're very much self-documenting. Once you learn CloudFormation, you're going to be able to understand what the template is doing. It may take you time to read through the template, because another interesting thing about the templates in CloudFormation is that CloudFormation knows the order to execute the various sections and even resources and declarations within the sections. So it's not really tied to the order that things appear in the template, as would another programming language be that you're used to programming in. So that's something to keep in mind. Then there's metadata, which generally provides additional information that's used by resources, and you'll see that as you work through your journey. You'll see some in here in the samples that we're going to walk through. And then there are parameters that I mentioned briefly earlier that can modify the template at deploy time. You can configure those in advance inside the template to basically ask the engineer who's deploying the template what they want to do, and you'll see examples of that, how they want to modify it, whether it's an IP address or a range of IP addresses, or providing a key pair for security, or other parameters. Then we have this thing called mappings, which is a lookup table, and we'll see an example of that later. And there can be a variety of different things that you look up. You can look up you can provide a choice of regions to the user where you want to deploy. You could allow the user to provide tagging as an example. And you could actually allow them to type in and you're going to see this actually, and it's something that's used all the time in examples. They could just type in the instance type they want, and the template will figure out, and we'll see this, what what AMI is appropriate for the region that you're in or that you want to deploy in. And so you'll see that, not all the AMIs are available in region. So this is a very good example. And there are other resources that are only available in certain regions. Then we're going to get into resources. And resources are really, well, for one thing, it's the only section of the template that's required. So we're in a minute going to look at a template that only has resources in it. And so this is your EC2 instance. This is your security groups. These are the primary building blocks of your deployed infrastructure. The rest of it is supporting those things that people are going to interact with when the stack is deployed, people and systems. Then there's properties, and then there's transform, which is not listed here. It's sort of an advanced topic that we get into in chapter 4. And then there's another one called conditions. So we'll take a look at that. Yeah, that's mentioned down here. And we'll get into those in detail. So we're going to go ahead, and I'm going to use Visual Studio Code. And we're going to pop over there in a second and take a look at the template we're going to deploy. But in this chapter, we've basically described all of the different sections of the template in detail. Just wanted to alert you that this is here. A lot of the examples of, here's an example of the parameters being typed in. Or supplied. Here's the mappings. There's a thing called intrinsic functions that we're going to see briefly, but that are described in great detail later. And then we get into the actual code of the template. So we'll return to this in chapter 3 in a moment. So now let's go ahead and deploy our first CloudFormation stack. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use VS Code. And here is my stack. The name of the stack, and it's in GitHub under chapter 2. It's called EC2 instance chapter 2 -ex1.json. And so as I mentioned, resources is the only section of the template that you need. You're going to see much, much more as we go through the examples here. And the resource I'm deploying, I'm naming it my server. It's an EC2 instance, and this is the type identifier for CloudFormation of an EC2 instance. There's a list of some of these in the book, and there's a comprehensive list in the AWS documentation, which is referenced in the book chapters. And then here's the properties of the instance. And in this case, we're doing something very, very simple. We're hard coding in the instance type, in this case, T2 micro, and then we're providing a hard-coded AMI. And these are things that generally are not CloudFormation best practices, but I wanted you to see the template format in a very, very simple way. We're going to make it a tiny bit more complicated with the second example, but not much more. And so what we're doing here is, you start out with a curly brackets, standard JSON format. Your text editor, if you're using JSON, you're going to want to have one that supports JSON because it's going to make it much easier to format the template, which is very important. Your template will not execute if you haven't formatted it in correct JSON. And yeah, that's all there is to it. So, so what I'm going to do for our first example is I'm going to go run this template from the console. And so I'm going to start out here. And under services, CloudFormation is actually under management and governance. So here it is down here. I'm going to go ahead and go into CloudFormation. Gives you a description of how it works. AWS has really upped their game in terms of the documentation that's available for everything right there in the console. So if you're new, this is going to be really valuable to you. I'm going to click Create Stack. Once you've created stacks, you'll skip this screen and you'll go right to CloudFormation. Now I'm in the, where the rubber hits the road with CloudFormation, but it's still step by step. Specify template, specify the stack details, configure the stack options, review, and then create the stack. So the first thing I'm going to do is, we've already created the template. We've prepared the template. Template is ready. I can choose from a sample template from AWS, which is another great way to get started. And then I can create one in Designer. We'll take a look at that in a couple of minutes. You can either store your templates in S3. I mentioned you can keep them in a version control system as well, like Git. And you can also upload here. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to upload. Now, I do have them in Git, obviously. I have them in GitHub. But in the interest of simplicity, I'm just going to upload this from my workstation here. So I choose the file. And here's the, I cloned the GitHub repository into AWS CloudFormation in action on my workstation. It'll bring down all the folders. And I'm just going to choose Chapter 2, Example 1. I'm going to open it. And I'm going to hit Next. It checks it very, very quickly. It's a small stack. Now, the name of your stack is not the same as the name of the template. You have to give it a unique name. It's a unique name for you, unlike S3 buckets that are unique globally. And I'm going to call it my first stack. And I'll hit Next. I can give it a tag if I want to. I'm going to skip this. I can give it permissions. I'm going to skip that and let it just use my permissions, which is the default for CloudFormation. There are a bunch of other configuration elements that we discussed throughout the book, but I'm going to just go ahead and hit Next down here. Now I'm reviewing the choices that I made, which becomes more and more important as the template becomes more complicated and what you're deploying becomes more complicated. So here's my template. And now it's taken my template from my machine and put it into an S3 bucket. So that's something that is discussed in detail in the book. You can have it estimate cost for you. It's going to take you to one of the ever-improving AWS cost calculators. This is not going to cost much. In fact, it's free tier eligible. It's a T2 micro instance. Then we could specify other details like parameters, but we're not going to do that here either. And then any options, again, tags, permissions, these are all the choices that we made before. What we want to happen when it rolls back, also discussed in detail in the book. And any notifications that we've configured. And options. Rollback on failure as a default is enabled. And we're going to go ahead and create the stack. Now, it takes me right into this Events tab. And as you can see, it says Create in Progress, initiated by the user, my first stack. I can hit the refresh button here, and I can watch the progress that CloudFormation is making in deploying my stack. And it'll tell me if it fails or if there's a problem. And if there is, it's going to roll it back. We're not going to see that in this case because this template is good and the stack is good and it's been created. So let's go back really, really quickly and take a look at what we just deployed, right? We deployed an EC2 instance, T2 micro with this AMI. I'm working in US East 2 at the moment. And so this is the US East 2 AMI. Let's go back to CloudFormation. And actually, we're going to go to the EC2 dashboard. And up, I have 2 running instances because I didn't delete a prior one. And we're going to go ahead and refresh. Oh, that's funny. No, I'm sorry. That page hadn't been refreshed. Let's take a look. Oh, it still thinks I have 2 instances. That's funny. Well, this, in fact, is not the instance that... Oh, I'm sorry. I had a tag set. So there we are. All right, there's my 2 instances. This is the one that we just deployed. T2 micro, US East 2 in the C availability zone. And if we wanted to check the AMI, we could do that. Here it is, blown out into its full glory, AMI 02 CCB 288. And that is what we had asked for. There we are. So now a really, really important thing, since we're talking about creating a stack, updating a stack, deleting a stack. Once you've deployed CloudFormation infrastructure, you always want to update it with CloudFormation. So in other words, if I want to delete my EC2 instance that I created, I'm not going to delete it here by choosing action instance state terminate, right? I'm going to ask CloudFormation to do it. And why this is so important is when you have a lot of resources in your infrastructure, they can get out of sync with the template, and that's going to defeat the purpose of using an infrastructure as code tool. The purpose of the infrastructure as code tool, it's described in an entire chapter of the book, is to make things more reliable, repeatable, manageable, allow your team to manage the infrastructure more easily with software. And so if you go out of band and you create things, they're separate from your infrastructure as code environment. Now, the good news is AWS has pretty recently created an import feature, but it's a best practice to do everything through CloudFormation when you've adopted CloudFormation. So I'm going to go ahead and not terminate here. I'm going to go back to my CloudFormation console. And I'm going to just go ahead and delete it by clicking on the stack and hitting delete. This will delete all the stack resources. You can prevent stacks from being deleted. You can permission who can delete stacks. And in fact, with pretty good granularity, what they can do. But I'm the sysop here. I'm going to go ahead and delete this stack. And I can go into the stack info here, go to events, and watch it being deleted. And this will only take a minute, very small stack. Meanwhile, I am going to go back to EC2. You don't have to stay on this page. I'm going to go to EC2. And I'm going to delete this other instance that I accidentally left running earlier. And by the way, that's something you got to be really careful with when you're experimenting, when you're learning, is, some of these stacks that are examples that you'll find on the web, or even a couple that I'm providing, they use resources that you're going to be charged money for, okay? And so you should investigate I'm going to go ahead and start this. You should investigate how much they're going to cost you, because generally, and absolutely with all the examples that I'm providing, they're not going to cost you very much. They're going to cost you pennies or $1 to deploy. as long as you delete them after the exercise. If you leave them running for a day or two, it's not going to be a huge tragedy in general in terms of the resources that I'm using as examples. But if you use a bigger, instance type, you're gonna, some of them cost hundreds of dollars a month just for one instance, and you need to be very, very careful to delete your experimental infrastructure. And now let's go ahead and what we're going to do is we're going to deploy our second template. So let's take a look at it. And so the second template in chapter 2 is it's a very, very similar. It's the exact same instance type. What we've done is we've added a deletion policy to it that's retain, and that means that it's going to retain the instance after we delete it. And then I've added tags to it that name it and that provide a dev tag in the keyword staged. And that's actually, I was making sure everything was working here. So that's what where that other instance came from. That was this one. So let's go ahead and deploy this one, and you'll just see the very, very minor difference that it makes. And actually, you know what? I'm going to deploy it here from the command line. So I'm going to go down to my VS Code terminal, and I've already got the command typed in the interest of time, but the command I'm going to use is AWS CloudFormation create -stack -stack name my stack 2, we'll call it. Then I'm just pointing to a file that's in this Windows directory that I'm in, which I cloned from GitHub. And I'm providing file : / and the name of the file in the directory that I'm in. Oop. All right, that was pushing the wrong button. It's inevitable in any demo. And now we'll go ahead and do this from the command line. And it's done. It provides me with the stack ID, my stack 2, gives me an Amazon resource number. And let's go back and take a look in the console and see what's happened. And of course, we can get status from the command line as well. There's a lot of commands. In fact, I popped open cancel update stack, continue update rollback. There's many, many commands in the command line. Everything you can do from the console, you can do from the command line, and probably more. So here's the one that I just deployed, same name as the previous one. This one's terminated. And so this is there. Everybody's happy. And there you have it. And we can go take a look at it. Or actually what we can do here is let's filter by tag. And there's my tags. I've got the name, and the only one that I have running is my server, but I could also identify it by the stack name. And then I can also choose the stage, and so I'll have it show me only the dev, and both of them are because, again, I had run I had deployed that stack before and it had the same name in the template. So, all right, again, now we need to delete this. And so we'll go ahead and delete the stack. And we can do that. Actually, you know what? We're going to update it. No, we're not going to update it. We're going to go ahead and delete it. So we'll just go back over to the console. And you can interchangeably do any of these things you want to from the command line, from the API, or from the console. So I'm going to go back to the console, and we'll go ahead and delete it. And that'll take a minute to do. And it's done. All right. So that is our example of the simple deployment. Now let's take a look at our website. So let's take a quick look at the template, calling it my basic static website.json, and it's going to create a static HTML5 website using a single EC2 instance, and it's going to have a really basic security group. It's going to be open to the world. We'll talk about these things here in a moment. Let's pop over to chapter 3 and take a look at how we're describing this thing. So again, the Stack Formation Lifecycle, chapter 3, create, update, delete, using a static website running on EC2. We've created that template, but as you go through the chapter, you'll actually understand each section of the template in great detail. You're going to provide the instance type, the AMI, and security at the time of the creation of the stack using parameters. So you'll see how that works. We get started with versioning and change management so we can update the website without redeploying or even logging into the instance. So, unlike perhaps a manually deployed website, this website is built in such a way, and this template is built in such a way where we can update the code and we can see when the code has been updated, and it will allow CloudFormation to alert you that it needs to be updated. So that's a key feature of what you can do with CloudFormation, create pipelines and managing versions across your entire infrastructure. So very simple example here in this chapter, and much more as the chapters progress. As I mentioned, chapter 5, it's coming soon, to the ebook, is all about managing change. So the stack lifecycle, your JSON or YAML template, this is review, CloudFormation stack deployed. There are multiple ways to deploy, to build templates. We get into more detail here. We talk in great detail about how to do updates, why you would do updates, and why it's important not to make changes out of band once you've started to use CloudFormation. When you do that, it actually has a name. It's called template drift, and you can look that up in Google and you'll get a lot of really great examples of it, but the book also describes it in great detail. And then in chapter 5, the upcoming chapter, we actually show you exactly how to handle template drift in great detail. There's actually a relatively recent feature in CloudFormation that detects template drift. So that's very useful, and we talk about that in chapter 5. So one great thing about CloudFormation updates as well, with most infrastructure as code tools, I think with the exception of Terraform and probably Pulumi right now, which I've only just looked at it very cursorily, you need to deploy the infrastructure to see whether it's going to work or not. Now, we actually are covering a number of very good testing tools that have been built around AWS. And that also is in the Managing Change chapter, chapter 5. But you also, with updates called change sets in CloudFormation, you can actually see what the changes are that are going to happen before you create the stack. So this is a really, really important, great feature to, some of the stacks, when they get larger and more complicated, they will take time to deploy. And so, that time spread across a large infrastructure with a large number of engineers is more than you're going to want to invest. And so being assured that the template is going to execute and that the infrastructure is going to deploy is a really great benefit. So then in this chapter, we also go into great detail on what happens when updates are being deployed, because depending on what kind of update it is, it may not impact the running infrastructure in a negative way. For example, if you have one web server and you're deploying an update to it, there's a chance that it's going to be offline for maybe even as much as a minute or two, depending on what's on it and what you're doing to it. So that's not something you would want to have happen. You'd want to know that that was going to happen, and that and mitigate it. You'd mitigate it by deploying the new one, changing the DNS, while the old one is still running, and then the traffic switches over. And these are things that we'll be talking about in the book and in further chapters, and we begin to talk about in chapter 5, but it's actually in chapter 6 that we're going to get into it in more detail, which is the chapter that I'm working on right now. You can also cancel updates while they're in progress, but here's a brief description of some of the things that are impacted. If you're changing a CloudWatch alarm in the template, that's not going to have any impact on the availability of that resource. Some changes, like the user data, which we're going to look at in a minute, those would have a low to moderate impact depending on the application itself and how long it takes to start. So that's not going to swap out the instance. That's just going to change the website code that's installed on the instance. So it depends on how long it takes to get it and restart that website. And then if there is one that's being removed and replaced, like the actual change of the instance, or the moving to a different availability zone, that's going to deploy a new resource. And so it's going to replace the old one, and there could be minutes of impact on availability. So let's take a look and see if there's anything exciting here. I want to get into the template. There's the retain deletion policy that I described, and how it applies to certain resources. And we're going to go ahead and, so we recap some of the types of the sections and what we're doing with them in here. And then when we go to, here's the mappings described that I mentioned earlier. And that's out on GitHub, of course. We talk about the idea of Bootstrap using CloudFormation helper scripts and user data. And in the previews of the book, several of the reviewers really liked this section, because this is sort of a relatively complex area that a lot of people haven't used before or don't fully understand. We don't have enough time for me to do a deep dive into it, but I encourage you to read this chapter of the book to understand this. The user data is basically a script And you've probably used it if you're using AWS from the console as well, maybe even from the command line. But you can embed that user data, that script, that shell script into the template, and then you can use the helpers to actually install the software and start services as part of your stack deployment. So it's really, really cool. Those helpers are called CFN init, and that installs packages. You can actually create files in the template and start services, and we're going to see the code for that in a minute. Signal can be used with a creation policy or a wait condition, so you can synchronize other resources in the stack when there's a prerequisite. So I mentioned earlier that CloudFormation has its own order of deploying the items in the template, and over time you'll become very familiar with that. But the CFN init script and CFN signal will actually let you wait for another resource to become available before the website is deployed. For example, if we're installing Apache web server, HTTPD, you need to wait for it before the website gets deployed. Otherwise, if it's an initial deployment, the actual path might not be there for you to put your HTML into, and the deployment would fail, or the website just simply wouldn't work. And then we have CFN hook update, or HUP. And what this does is this checks for updates to the metadata in the template and then executes a custom hook in this, via this helper to go get the new website or deploy the new website based on the fact that you changed the metadata to a different path, as an example. So really powerful feature. And let's go ahead and go over and look at the template. We've only got a few minutes left. We'll look at our website deployment template. And so we start out with a description, then we have these parameters. We're going to let the engineers deploying the website, you specify a key pair. There are a lot of other ways you can do this besides having somebody type it in. So you can use AWS Secrets Manager as an example, and we talk about those things in the book. Then we choose the instance type. We can choose from several different instance types. In this case, we're using T2 small, and then it's going to limit the choices that the user can make to just a particular set of instance types. And then we want to allow the user to, or that engineer, I might say, to SSH into the IP address of into the EC2 instance, into our web server. And here we're specifying the IP address range that engineer can come from to access the website with SSH. So, and the default is wide open to the internet, which, I often do when I'm not sure if, if other things are working properly, blow it open and then lock it down. That's sort of, if I'm going into production, I'm going to lock everything down and then open it up, of course, layering the defense on. But anyway, those are our parameters. Then we have the mappings that I mentioned or described in great detail in the chapter. There are all the different instance types, and they're going to key off these AMIs. So you're only specifying the instance type, and then it's going to look up the AMI to use depending on the region that we're in. I mentioned we're in US East 2, and so here's that one, HVM 64 instance and AMI. So then we're going to define our EC2 instance for the web server. And the metadata for this is this install and run that's described further down in the chapter. And what this is for, this metadata section, is to go install the packages and configure the server. Here we're actually installing HTTPD, the Apache web server, using Yum. Then we're going to actually, in this case, what we're doing is we're making a file called cfn-hup. I mentioned that's this hook update. And so it's configured using this configuration file that needs to be in a certain place, etc cfn. And so this is the description of what's in the file. And then this is a join intrinsic function described in great detail in the book. And then here we're setting the permission for this so that it can do the things that it needs to do. Then we're making another config file here that's going to look at the metadata, and it's going to configure an auto reload after an update happens to the website code. Again, described in great detail in the book. Here we are making sure that it's running, the web server's running, and the cfn-hup helper is running, and tells it where to find it. So if we reconfigured the auto reloader, then we're going to go ahead and have a different state. So then we've got the properties of the web server. Now here we're referring to that mapping that we created. So we're using the intrinsic function find and map, also described in the book in great detail, to get the image ID. We know the instance type. The security group is defined further down in the template. The key name we got from the parameters. And then here's the user data that I mentioned. It's a bash script, and it's doing a yum update. It's getting the bootstrap. It's installing the files, signaling the status, and then we're downloading the website from html5up.net. If you haven't seen that, it's a very cool website with open source HTML5 attractive looking websites. We'll take a look at one in a minute. And then this creation policy is going to make sure that this happens after HTTPD is deployed. Here's our security group. We're using CloudFormation to open up port 80 and our SSH location port 22. And then we used outputs and another intrinsic function to show the user the URL for the newly created website stack. So let's go ahead and deploy this. This is going to take a minute. We're going to pop back into CloudFormation. And we'll go ahead and hit Create Stack. We're going to upload a new template. Choose that file. It's my first stack. Oop, I need to be in Chapter 3. Sorry about that. I'm going to go to Chapter 3. This one is called My Basic Static Website. And I'm going to call this Stack HTML5. I can choose from this is where I define those parameters in the template. I've got a drop-down menu. I'm going to stay with the default T2 small. I get a drop-down of the key pairs. I'm going to use generic key pair. And I'm going to leave the SSH location as open to the internet. and then immediately delete it. I can provide tags. I could also do those from within the template as we saw before. I haven't done any of the advanced options. I'm going to go ahead and hit next. Lets me review. I'm going to go ahead and create the stack. There it goes. We'll watch it by refreshing. It's deploying the web server security group. That also needs to be there before the instance is deployed. This is more typical. There's a bunch of resources being deployed out there. So we need to wait a little while for this to happen. In fact, it's waiting for the conditional wait state to be satisfied. Hopefully it's not 5 minutes. May actually have been. Bear with me. You know, while we're doing this, I'm going to pop over here and I'm going to give you the 40% off on the Manning ebooks. It's TWIT as in Twitch, GEHM, the first 4 letters of my last name, and the number 40. Enjoy. I hope you found this valuable and read my book. It's been great writing it. I've learned a tremendous amount myself. There we are. Create complete. Now we're going to go to outputs. And there's our website. I'm going to open it in a new tab. And there's our website out on the web, hosted by AWS. So that's our session for today. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was valuable and that you learned something about infrastructure as code and CloudFormation. And hopefully I'll see you again soon. You can join me in the Meep and give me feedback on the book as I continue to write it. I would very much appreciate that.